Erica here with Prep Scholar GMAT. We're here today with Alan Chung, one of the Prep Scholar co-founders. Last year, Alan and I took the GMAT with some of the other folks here at Prep Scholar, and we both came out with the exact same 770 GMAT score. So we thought we'd sit down today to talk about each of our approaches to the GMAT, our test day experiences and score breakdowns, as well as to give some advice to students aiming for a 770 or similar GMAT score. As always, if you like this video, please hit the button to subscribe. And feel free to head over to our website to check out our online program and online tutoring options. And also head over to our blog for even more great GMAT content. As always, links are in the description. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll jump right in. One of your claims to fame is your perfect SAT score. How is the GMAT different from the SAT or other tests that you've taken?
Yeah. The place I would start is probably thinking about skills and content. And I think in many ways, the content on the GMAT is pretty similar to that of the SAT. So I think it doesn't have any really advanced material like calculus or anything like that. But I would say the major difference between the GMAT and any other test is its adaptive nature, which I think adds a whole new kind of strategic layer and psychological layer to it. Some of this we'll talk about in a bit. But I would say that's the biggest difference between them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add that in addition to just the kind of psychological layer of that adaptive nature, one of the things that I think is really cool about the GMAT is that it really focuses on critical thinking and decision making. I think pretty much every standardized test says, it's not really about the content, it's about how you think about it. But I think that the GMAT actually does it in a way that a lot of these other tests don't do as well. So for example, sentence correction and data sufficiency, you need to know math and you need to know grammar, but what it's actually testing is, can you figure out what you need to know to solve the problem and such.
I see. How does that change the way that you prep for the GMAT versus for other tests, do you think?
That's a really great question. I think for other tests, it's a lot easier to just kind of memorize things. And if you have the right things in your tool belt, then you'll be okay on test day. And it makes it a lot easier to kind of cram and do flashcards and stuff like that. For the GMAT, you really need to know your strategy and you really need to know your approaches and you need to be one with the test, So I think that to really get a good score on the GMAT, you need to spend more time just getting in that right mindset and mind frame.
Got it.
So great question from Alan. Next question would be, how did you prep for the GMAT?
Yeah, so like Erica mentioned, we took this as part of a company activity. So I didn't spend as much time preparing for it as I would have if I were an MBA student. But I kind of broke up my prep into a few major stages. The first was, since I was new to the test, just understanding the kind of structure of it, the format, how many questions there were, what the test looked like, even how you interacted with the test, and what all the different skill pieces were, and just making sure I covered anything that was novel or new to me. For instance, the integrated reasoning section is pretty different from other aspects. Like you mentioned, it really delves more into comprehension in general, kind of critical reasoning. And so I just did a few practice questions there to make sure that, kind of dipping my toe in the water of the pool, basically, to make sure I was familiar with it. All of that was preparation for the bulk of my prep, which was taking the practice test and just making sure that that was as realistic an experience as possible. And so that was probably the bulk of my prep, and just thinking through as I was taking the practice test what my strategy would be on test day, how I was managing time, and just kind of constantly reflecting on how I was doing when I took the practice test. Then afterward, after getting my score breakdown, I reviewed the questions that I had missed and tried to see if there were any patterns to things that I had missed. Like, was I missing any particular skill weakness that led me to make those mistakes, or did I have any mistake in my test strategy? Then I did some final kind of last day prep, just preparing things like for the essay portion, making sure I had pre-constructed arguments that I could use or a skeleton that I could use, brushing up on any skill weaknesses. So that was the extent of my prep for the test.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really like that you talked about focusing in on the problems that you missed on your practice test. We actually just put out a video about making error logs and how that's really beneficial to capturing your own weaknesses and making sure you improve on those. I think that that's one of the things that I did that I thought was really helpful is once I found out we were taking the test, as I was working through different problems, which I do for my job, I, took notes and, noted some strategies that would be beneficial to me on specifically for problems that I found challenging. What I didn't really do was do that very realistic practice test, and I think that's probably the thing that I would do differently is to spend a little bit more time in that very realistic timed environment. But yeah, I think that really focusing on our mistakes is the thing that we kind of share in common there.
Cool. Did you review the error log right before the test?
I did. That's typically not something I recommend to most students. I say morning of, just be awake and do a bit of a walk, eat a good breakfast, do some deep breaths and visualize. But I was working on, a really crunch timeline, which again, don't recommend. So I did review morning of, but what I think was really helpful was I reviewed the night before, and just kind of had that, to solidify overnight. So I think that was helpful because I definitely on test day went, oh, that's that one thing that I messed up yesterday. I need to get it right today.
Right. Cool.
So I thought that was really helpful. Okay, we talked a bit about how you made the most of your one practice test. What was your experience like on test day, and how did it compare to that practice test you took?
So when I took the practice test, I really try to mimic the test environment as much as possible. And I think that's really important. Just make sure that you time yourself accurately, you don't give yourself any extra time, and you really feel that timing pressure. And even try to get into the psychological, the mindset that you will be on test day. If you tend to get nervous on test day like I do, then just pretend it's a real thing. So those are some pieces that help me get the most out of that practice test. And so going into the test day, I think there are probably two aspects that are worth noting. One is I'm pretty sensitive to my test environment, so exactly where you take the test, how many people are around you, what noise there is. By and large, I found the test center really professional, and check-in was super simple. There wasn't a line. I was able to get in, get out on time, and the test center was really quiet. Everyone was just kind of taking different tests. There wasn't a lot of kind of competitive pressure that I felt like you might in the SAT when you're sitting with all the other kids who are taking the SAT. So I found that really non-distracting, which was a pleasant surprise because something I personally worry about a lot when taking standardized tests is how is the environment going to change my performance. So that was a pleasant surprise that didn't happen. I think as far as the test goes, the major difference from the practice test is I felt a lot of timing pressure for the quant section. And for the verbal section, I actually didn't have that much timing pressure. I ended with about 20 minutes of free time, and I was really confident about my answers. But for the quant section, I felt that I was probably taking more time than I should have on each question. And this is what I mentioned about the adaptive nature of the test and how it adds a psychological layer where because you can never go back and review your questions, I just felt a lot more pressure to make sure I had the question correct. And often I tended to oversolve a question, such as solving the same question in multiple ways to make sure that you have the right answer. And I probably overcompensated a bit for that, and that contributed to some time pressure. But I just really wanted to make sure that I got the questions right since I knew it would influence my later questions.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think we had really similar timing experience. For me, the verbal section, I think I went way too fast. I ended up with, similarly about 20 minutes to spare. On the quant, though, I also felt that pressure, but I think I went the opposite direction because I knew that I would probably run out of time. So I think I went the direction of guessing maybe a little too early, which, I didn't have too much extra time at the end, but I think that might have contributed. My score dropped about 10 points. So I would say that would be the main thing that was different for me. Did you get the same score on your practice test as you did on test day?
I think it was in the right ballpark. I didn't really take too much stock in my practice test score because I knew it wasn't the full adaptive experience, and I also knew the test might have been outdated. But I think it was in the same ballpark.
Gotcha. Cool. So we both got ESRs, or enhanced score reports, for the test that we took. So I compared the two and was really interested to see that even though we got the same overall score, we had really different kind of score breakdowns. So the two things that I kind of wanted to note were that we got the same quant score, but we actually got two different verbal scores, about 1 point apart. and yet we still got the same overall score. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that even though we got that same quant score, I actually missed significantly more questions, and we were at roughly the same level. But on one section, I was actually at a slightly easier level, but yet same score. So what do you think we can take away from the fact that these very different actual tests led to that same overall score?
For me, I think the main takeaway is that you really can't predict what your score is going to be based on the experience of the test.
Yeah.
I know something that a lot of new GMAT studiers worry about is, if you miss a question, that's going to punish you for the rest of the test. And I think this can add a lot of psychological stress when you're taking the test, where you just worry if you got some easy questions, whether that means you're doomed and you're going to get a terrible score. And then you can really get in your own head, and this just causes a vicious cycle of stress that I think can really push your score down. So I think something that I noticed when I was taking the test, for example, was that I would get a really difficult question followed by 2 or 3 really easy questions, and this would make me think, well, did I miss that hard question? Like, is a test just punishing me for missing that question? But based on the ESR, it turns out that that wasn't the case.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of randomness to the algorithm in which questions it selects in which order, and you really shouldn't read too much into that on test day. You can actually have very different test experiences from someone else, even from your practice tests, and end up with a very similar score.
Right. Yeah. I think an additional thing, in addition to kind of like the randomness of the algorithm, I think is also kind of our perception. Like maybe something that I think of as like an easy question and go in my head, oh no, I missed the last one, is something that other test takers might find really challenging. And maybe that's just something that comes more naturally to me, or maybe that's something that I studied yesterday, and so it's just fresh. And the other thing I would say is be skeptical about unofficial practice tests. Don't, take that score as gospel. Take it with a grain of salt. That algorithm is really complicated and hard to replicate. So when you can, use official practice materials to judge your score. So if you were to take the test again, what would you do differently to get those last 30 points, and would you?
Yeah, I think for the purposes of MBA admissions, a 770 or any score in that range is good enough to get you into any school that you would reasonably want to go to. Once you, I think, meet their criteria for the score or roughly in the range, they'll look at the rest of your application, and that's where that's going to have a lot more weight. So for the purpose of that, I probably wouldn't take it again. But if I were to try to get a higher score, I would probably spend more time on the quant section, but my verbal section for my ESR showed that I was probably doing fine there. The quant, I missed a few questions, and I felt more timing pressure. So I would probably start off by taking more difficult quant questions and just practicing those and seeing really the extreme ranges of what I might see on test day, and also practice the timing pressure a bit more. So maybe try to develop a general strategy for things like data sufficiency so that when I took the test, because I didn't prep very much, it was more ad hoc. Every question I approach a bit differently based on what exactly was given to me, but maybe something more methodical might help relieve some of the time pressure.
Absolutely. All right, and then final question. I think I would approach it very similarly. What is your #1 recommendation for someone aiming for a 770 GMAT score?
I think to get a score in the 99th percentile or in that ballpark really requires you to master a lot of different things and really drill them to near perfection. And so I think my one recommendation would be to identify where your specific weaknesses are and to keep drilling them until you are near perfection to them. And largely I would separate the two concerns into general skill and content knowledge and test strategy. And if you have weaknesses in either one of those, it can really prevent you from getting that top score. For instance, you can master all the content in the world, but if you are just not used to timing pressures or you don't solve problems efficiently, then you're not going to get a top score, and vice versa as well. So I think it's important to just be introspective, reflect on your mistakes, and do a lot of work, but also reflect on what you're learning and what you're having difficulty with, and just make sure that you have the right resources and the right approach to fixing those weaknesses.
Absolutely. To add to that, I would say, if you're aiming for a 99th percentile score, that kind of one-size-fits-all prep isn't really going to help. So approaching your weaknesses, and specifically your weaknesses, is really important. You can do this with self-study using techniques like the error log. But if you really are gunning for this score, investing in some options like personal tutoring or a customized program can really help with mastering those sorts of weaknesses. Well, that's about all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Alan.
Thanks for having me.
If you have any questions for either me or Alan, or suggestions for future videos, please leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching, and happy GMAT studies.